Anna and Mark had been planning their road trip for months, a spontaneous journey to escape the monotony of their daily lives. Armed with a GPS and an old road atlas for backup, they set out early one morning, ready for adventure. The day passed in a blur of laughter, winding roads, and scenic detours. As the sun dipped low, painting the horizon in hues of gold and crimson, their GPS lost signal. Mark tapped the screen in frustration, while Anna unfolded the atlas, its edges worn and creased from years of use. "Turn left," she suggested, pointing to a barely visible road snaking through dense woods. The further they drove, the darker the forest grew. Towering trees loomed overhead, their branches forming a tunnel that swallowed the car's headlights. The road narrowed, and an unsettling silence replaced the usual hum of nature. "Are we even on the map anymore?" Mark muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. Before Anna could answer, a wooden sign emerged from the darkness. "Welcome to Havens Hollow, where time stands still." The words sent a chill down Anna's spine, but the sight of a village nestled in the valley below brought a wave of relief. Warm lights twinkled from cozy cottages, and smoke curled lazily from chimneys. The village was a picture-perfect scene straight out of a storybook. Stone cottages lined cobblestone streets, flower boxes overflowed with vibrant blooms, and lanterns flickered softly in the gathering dusk. When they pulled into the square, villagers emerged, their faces glowing with smiles that seemed too wide, too perfect. "You must be tired," an elderly woman with silver hair said, her voice soothing yet oddly mechanical. "Come, we'll take care of you." The villagers bustled around them, offering fresh bread, warm tea, and endless hospitality. The mayor, a tall man with piercing eyes and an unnerving air of authority, insisted they stay at the inn. "You'll find no place more welcoming than Havens Hollow," he declared. The inn was charming, with creaky wooden floors and a roaring fireplace. The innkeeper handed them a room key without asking for payment. "Guests of the Hollow are always welcome," he said, bowing slightly. As night fell, Anna and Mark strolled through the village. Despite the picturesque setting, something felt off. The villagers' laughter seemed rehearsed. Their eyes lingered too long, and their movements were unnaturally synchronized. "We should leave first thing in the morning," Anna whispered. But morning brought more questions than answers. When they tried to leave, the road out of Havens Hollow inexplicably looped back into the square. Every route they took, north, south, east, west, ended where it began. The once charming village now felt like a prison. "Why can't we leave?" Mark demanded, confronting the mayor. The mayor's smile didn't waver. "Why would you want to? Havens Hollow provides everything you need. There's no reason to go anywhere else." Their unease grew as they noticed oddities. No clocks, no cell towers, no vehicles other than their own. It was as if the village existed outside of time, untouched by the modern world. One evening, Anna discovered an old ledger in the inn's basement. Its pages were filled with names and dates, some centuries old. She gasped when she reached the final page. Her name and Mark's were written in fresh ink, alongside today's date. Terrified, they confronted the innkeeper, but he only shook his head sadly. "The Hollow chooses its residents," he said. "Once you're here, you're part of it." Desperation turned to terror as the villagers' demeanor shifted. Their smiles became sinister, their gestures threatening. The couple decided to make one last attempt to escape, running into the forest on foot. The trees seemed alive, their branches reaching out like fingers to block the path. Shadows moved in the periphery, whispering their names. No matter how far they ran, they always ended up back in the square, where the villagers waited in eerie silence. Exhausted and defeated, Anna and Mark returned to the inn. The villagers greeted them with knowing nods, as if they had seen this happen countless times before. Weeks later, travelers passing through Havens Hollow are greeted by two new villagers, a man and a woman with hollow smiles and eyes that betray a deep, unspoken sorrow. The couple has learned the truth of Havens Hollow. It isn't a sanctuary, but a trap. The village thrives on its residents, and no one ever leaves. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, its dense canopy blocking out even the faintest hint of starlight. A group of friends, Jake, Anna, Sarah, and Mark, wandered through the shadows, their flashlights barely penetrating the gloom. They had lost the trail hours ago, and their phones were useless, showing no signal. "I told you we should have turned back when we had the chance," Sarah muttered, her voice edged with frustration. "And I told you we'd find shelter," Mark replied. "We just have to keep moving." As if on cue, a structure emerged from the darkness, a small wooden cabin, its edges obscured by creeping vines. Its windows were dark, but a thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth and safety. "Finally," Jake said, quickening his pace. Anna hesitated. "It feels wrong," she murmured. But the others were already at the door, pushing it open with a creak that echoed through the silent forest. Inside, the cabin was unexpectedly tidy, its wooden floors polished to a faint sheen. Shelves lined the walls, filled with handcrafted marionettes. Each one was unique, painted with an eerie precision that made their glassy eyes seem alive. They hung from strings that disappeared into the shadows of the high ceiling, swaying gently as if stirred by an unseen breeze. "This place is giving me the creeps," Anna said, clutching Jake's arm. "It's weird, yeah?" Jake admitted. "But at least it's warm." They lit a fire in the stone hearth and found canned food in the pantry. The warmth of the flames eased their nerves, though the oppressive silence of the forest seemed to seep through the walls. The marionettes cast long, warped shadows in the firelight, their lifelike faces appearing almost animated. As the night deepened, the cabin's strange atmosphere grew heavier. It began with faint creaks and groans, the sound of old wood settling, or so they thought. Then came the rustling of strings and the tap-tap of tiny wooden feet against the floor. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes darting to the nearest marionette. "Just the wind," Mark said, though his voice wavered. But when Sarah turned again, she froze. One of the marionettes, a small girl in a faded dress, was no longer on the shelf. Instead, it sat on the floor, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Who moved that?" she stammered, backing away. No one answered. Then the marionettes began to stir. At first it was subtle, a twitch of a hand, a turn of the head. But soon, they were moving with fluid, almost human-like precision. One by one, they descended from their shelves, their glass eyes gleaming in the firelight. "The strings!" Anna cried, pointing upward. Above them, the rafters were lined with impossibly long strings that stretched into the darkness, far beyond where the cabin's roof should have ended. The strings moved on their own, tugging the marionettes into action. "We need to get out of here," Mark shouted, rushing to the door. But the door wouldn't budge. The windows were unbreakable, no matter how hard they tried. The cabin seemed alive, its walls pulsing faintly, as if it were breathing. A low, gravelly voice echoed through the room, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "You've entered my domain. You cannot leave." The group turned to see a new marionette, a tall figure dressed in a tattered suit, stepping forward with unnatural grace. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, and its wooden fingers flexed as if testing their range. "You must stay," it rasped. "The master is coming." "Who's the master?" Anna whimpered, her voice barely audible. The marionette didn't answer. Instead, the strings above began to descend, snaking toward the group like living tendrils. They wrapped around their arms and legs, pulling them upward despite their desperate struggles. Then he appeared. From the shadows of the rafters, a figure descended, a gaunt man with a cracked porcelain mask obscuring his face. His skeletal hands moved with inhuman speed, manipulating the strings like a macabre conductor. "You'll make perfect additions to my collection," he whispered, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. The marionettes attacked, their wooden limbs unnaturally strong. Jake swung a chair at one, shattering it, but two more replaced it, their movements unnervingly synchronized. Anna screamed as the strings lifted her into the air, her limbs contorting as if controlled by invisible hands. "Stop struggling," the masked figure said, his tone almost amused. "It only makes the transformation worse." Hours later, the cabin was silent once more. The marionettes were back on their shelves, their expressions eerily serene. Among them hung 4 new additions, wooden figures with lifelike faces, their glass eyes filled with frozen terror. The forest swallowed the cabin again, waiting patiently for its next victims to stumble upon its sinister allure. It was a long, exhausting drive. Adam had been on the road for hours, the monotonous hum of his car filling the empty night. He had passed through countless small towns, each one fading away behind him like the fading memories of the day. As he reached a stretch of road with nothing but thick forest on either side, he decided it was time to stop for a break. He pulled his car over to the side of the road and noticed an old bridge ahead. The rusted metal and creaking wooden planks looked like something out of an old horror movie. It was strange to find such a bridge here, isolated and forgotten. But Adam was tired, and he needed to stretch his legs. He grabbed his jacket and stepped out of the car, the cool night air hitting him like a shock. The moon hung high, casting long shadows across the bridge. It was quiet, too quiet, and the only sound was the rush of the dark water below. Adam leaned on the railing, gazing at the water, his mind wandering aimlessly. For a moment, it was peaceful. He tried to focus on the sound of the river beneath him, the rhythm of its currents lapping at the rocks. But the eerie stillness of the place began to gnaw at him, making him uncomfortable. It was too calm, too unnatural. The silence seemed like something that had been waiting for him. That's when he saw it. On the far side of the bridge, standing motionless, was a figure. It was tall and unnaturally still, like a statue, barely discernible in the moonlight. Adam squinted, trying to make out any details, but the figure was too far away. It was the shape of a person, yet something felt wrong about it. The darkness around it seemed to shift, as if the figure was made from shadows themselves. He blinked, thinking he was seeing things, but the figure didn't disappear. It didn't move, not an inch. It just stood there, staring at him. Adam felt a shiver race up his spine. "It's just my imagination," he muttered, but even as the words left his lips, they felt hollow. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to turn around and leave. But still, the figure stood. The longer he stared at it, the more unsettling it became. It was as though the shadow itself was breathing, shifting slightly with every breath Adam took. A gust of wind suddenly swept across the bridge, and for a fleeting moment, the figure was obscured by the rustling of the trees. When the wind died down, the figure was no longer in the same spot. It had moved closer, just a few steps, but close enough for Adam to make out more details. It had a tall, thin frame, dressed in what looked like tattered black clothing. But it wasn't the clothes or the shape that terrified Adam. It was the eyes. Hollow, dark eyes that seemed to stare straight into his soul. Adam's heart began to pound. He wanted to run, but his feet felt glued to the spot. He opened his mouth to call out, but his voice was caught in his throat. The figure didn't respond. It didn't make a sound, just continued to watch him, unmoving. The silence between them stretched for what felt like an eternity. His breath quickened. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. The figure wasn't human. It couldn't be. It was too still, too lifeless. The air around Adam seemed to thicken, suffocating him as the shadows grew longer. The figure wasn't just watching him, it was waiting for something. Adam's mind raced, his body instinctively tensing as he took a step back. His eyes were locked on the figure, his muscles frozen in fear, as though his body knew that if he turned away, the figure would spring to life. "Who's there?" Adam finally managed to croak out, his voice barely a whisper against the silence. No answer. The figure simply tilted its head, slowly, as if considering him. And then it moved, just one small step forward. That was all it took. The flood of panic that followed hit Adam like a wave crashing over him. His instincts screamed for him to leave, but he couldn't look away from the thing on the bridge. The shadows surrounding it seemed to grow darker, reaching out toward him, pulling him in. Suddenly, the figure was no longer standing still. It took another step forward, and then another. Every time Adam moved, the figure moved with him. His breath came in shallow gasps as he began to back away, his legs trembling. The bridge seemed to stretch endlessly behind him, every direction offering no escape. As he turned to run, the sound of his footsteps echoing in his ears, he dared to glance over his shoulder. The figure was closer now, following him, gliding silently over the bridge, its eyes never leaving him. Adam's heart raced as he bolted toward his car. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking, his legs weak with fear. Just as he slid into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind him, he started the engine. He didn't dare look back. He couldn't. But as the car roared to life, his eyes were drawn to the rearview mirror. The figure was there, standing in the middle of the bridge, watching him as he sped off into the night. It didn't move, it didn't make a sound, but it was there, waiting. As Adam accelerated down the road, he couldn't shake the feeling that the bridge was still behind him, waiting. And no matter how fast he drove, no matter how far he went, it would always be there. The figure would always be there. And one day, it would catch up to him. And when it did, it would be too late to escape.